My son called to say dinner was canceled, so I stayed home, trusting his word. After that, I learned they hadn't skipped a thing. He, his wife, and her family gathered around a table stacked with food, every dish quietly charged to my credit card. Later, I slightly walked in, smiled, and made a single call. Their laughter drained, and their faces pale as the truth landed heavier than the meal itself. Before we continue, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe, and feel free to leave a comment too. The late afternoon sun of a crisp Sunday in October was casting long shadows across my kitchen floor, the kind of light that always felt peaceful, full of promise for a pleasant evening. For me, Arthur, Sunday evenings meant one thing: dinner with my son, Mark. It was a tradition we had kept since his mother passed away 5 years ago, a small anchor of normalcy in the shifting tides of our lives. The air was rich with the scent of rosemary and garlic from the roast I had been slowly cooking for the better part of the afternoon. A bottle of decent Cabernet was breathing on the counter, its dark red hue catching the fading light. Everything was set. This ritual was more than just a meal. It was a confirmation that the bond between us was still strong, a quiet language of love spoken through shared food and time. I checked the clock on the wall. It was a little after 5 p.m. Mark and his wife, Jessica, were usually prompt, arriving around 5:30. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, a small smile on my face as I imagined Mark's familiar complaint about the traffic and Jessica's polite but slightly distant greeting. She was a driven woman, an attorney at a big downtown firm, and sometimes I felt she viewed our simple Sunday dinners as more of an obligation than a pleasure. But she made Mark happy, and for a father, that's the currency that truly matters. I pulled the roasting pan from the oven, the heat warming my face, and admired the perfectly browned crust. It was one of my better efforts, a small point of pride. The familiar routine was comforting, a solid piece of ground in a world that often felt like it was spinning too fast. Just as I was setting the pan on the stove to rest, my phone buzzed on the granite countertop, its vibration sharp in the quiet kitchen. I saw Mark's name on the screen and answered, expecting to hear he was just a few minutes away. "Hey, Dad," his voice came through the speaker, but it lacked its usual warmth. It was strained, thin, and hurried. "Listen, something's come up. Jessica got called into a last-minute project at work, a real emergency. We have to cancel dinner tonight. I'm so sorry." The words tumbled out, one after the other, leaving no room for a breath. I leaned against the counter, my earlier contentment deflating like a punctured balloon. I pictured him pinching the bridge of his nose, a nervous habit he'd had since he was a boy, a tell that he was under some kind of stress. My own voice was steady when I replied, betraying none of my disappointment. "Don't you worry about it, son. Work is work, I understand completely." It was a plausible excuse, after all. I knew Jessica's career was demanding, filled with the kind of high-stakes pressure that didn't respect weekends or family traditions. This must be one of those times. It was the benign cover I gave his anxious tone, a simple, harmless explanation for the sudden change of plans. "We'll do it next week. You two take care of what you need to do." My mind was already calculating how to package up the roast into freezer-safe containers, salvaging the meal for another day. It was a practical problem, an easier thing to focus on than the hollow feeling growing in my chest. "Yeah, next week for sure. Absolutely. Got to run, Dad. Love you." The line went dead before I could say it back. The silence that followed was immense, a heavy blanket that smothered the cheerful atmosphere of the kitchen. The scent of rosemary and garlic now seemed cloying, a reminder of a meal that would not be shared. For a long moment, I just stood there, phone in hand, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock. The house felt cavernous, its emptiness amplified by the sudden cancellation. I slowly walked to the stove and turned off the burner. the small click of the knob sounding like a final punctuation mark on the evening's plans. Disappointment was a bitter taste in my mouth, sharp and unwelcome. I spent the next hour dismantling the evening I had so carefully constructed. The beautiful roast was carved and sealed into plastic bags, destined for a cold hibernation in the freezer. The wine was re-corked, its promise postponed. The dining table, set for 3, was stripped of its plates and silverware. Each action felt like a small defeat, a quiet retreat from a battle I hadn't known was being fought. I moved with a deliberate slowness, my movements mechanical. The joy had been drained from the space, leaving only the mundane reality of tidying up. I was just a man in an empty house, surrounded by too much food, and an evening with no purpose. It was a lonely feeling, one I hadn't allowed myself to truly feel in a long time. By 7 o'clock, I had settled into my favorite armchair in the living room, a microwaved dinner on a tray in front of me. The television was on, some generic crime drama filling the silence with meaningless chatter and canned suspense. I told myself it was fine. This was life. Adults have responsibilities, plans change, and it was foolish to feel so let down by something so trivial. But the feeling lingered, a quiet ache of being secondary, an option that could be easily erased from the schedule. I tried to focus on the flickering screen, on the actors pretending to solve a murder, but my mind kept drifting back to Mark's tense voice and the abrupt end to our call. It felt off, a discordant note in the familiar melody of our relationship. I was halfway through my bland meal, my attention only loosely tethered to the show, when my phone, sitting on the end table beside me, lit up. It wasn't a call or a text. It was a notification, accompanied by a soft electronic ping from my banking app. I glanced at it without much interest, assuming it was a reminder for a bill payment or some other piece of digital housekeeping. But the text on the screen made me pause, my fork hovering midway to my mouth. The notification was for a credit card charge, a charge that had been processed just moments ago at 7:13 p.m. on a Sunday evening. My eyes narrowed, focusing on the details that made no sense. It was a charge for $250, and the merchant's name made the air catch in my throat. The Oak Room. It was the name of the expensive steakhouse where I had made a reservation for the 3 of us, for Mark's birthday next month. A place for celebrations, not for a quiet Sunday when my son and his wife were supposedly dealing with a work emergency. For a long moment, I stared at the notification on my phone screen, the words, "The Oak Room," glowing with an accusatory light in the dim living room. The crime drama on television was reaching its crescendo, a symphony of manufactured tension that I usually found absorbing. But tonight, it was just background noise. My TV dinner, a Salisbury steak that tasted of cardboard and regret, sat half-eaten on its tray. The house was quiet, a profound silence I had grown accustomed to since Martha passed, filled only by the flickering blue light of the screen. Then, my phone lit up on the end table, a single notification piercing the gloom. My first thought was that it had to be a mistake. A simple, clerical error. Perhaps the restaurant had accidentally processed the deposit for my future reservation. I tried to fit the anomaly into a logical box, to find a benign explanation that would allow the world to slide back onto its proper axis and let me finish my meal in peace. I tapped the notification, and my banking app opened. The transaction was displayed in stark black and white. 7:13 p.m., $250. The details were undeniable. I could picture it. Thick-cut fillets, cooked to perfection, the kind of meal one has to celebrate a promotion or an anniversary. As I was trying to rationalize it, my phone chimed again, the sound no longer soft or electronic, but a blaring alarm shattering the stillness of my home. A new charge appeared. $180 for a wine selection. This wasn't a necessity. This was an indulgence, a deliberate choice to live lavishly on my dime. The ugly suspicion began to solidify into a sickening certainty. I held my breath, staring at the screen, a foolish part of me praying that there would be no more, that this was the extent of it. But the phone was relentless. The final insult arrived with a ping that was somehow softer, more insidious than the others. A third charge, a paltry $45.50. They weren't just eating, they were feasting, lingering over coffee and dessert, drawing out their perfect evening, completely indifferent to the man whose trust they were devouring with every bite. My mind raced, connecting dots I didn't want to connect. Mark's strained voice on the phone earlier, the rushed excuse about feeling unwell, the abrupt hang-up. It wasn't the sound of illness, it was the sound of a lie. The hurt was a physical thing, a sharp pain behind my ribs, but beneath it, something else was forming. A cold, hard anger. It was an anger born not just of the lie, but of the profound disrespect. A memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. I had been in the garden when he called 6 months ago, my hands covered in soil, feeling content. Mark's voice, laced with that carefully crafted panic, had shattered the afternoon's peace. It was a temporary shortfall, he'd said, a credit card emergency. I'd transferred the $5,000 from my own savings, money I had mentally earmarked for repairing the roof that spring. I did it without hesitation, because that's what a father does. I remembered my first meeting with Jessica, how her eyes seemed to catalog every item in my home, her ambition a palpable force. I had dismissed my unease as old-fashioned protectiveness, a father's reluctance to let his son go. Now I saw it for what it was, a warning I had failed to heed. My appetite was completely gone. I pushed the dinner tray away and began to pace the length of the living room, the worn floorboards creaking under my feet. They wouldn't. They couldn't. Mark was my son, the boy I had raised to be honest, to look a man in the eye. My path took me past the mantelpiece, a gallery of happier times. There he was as a child, missing 2 front teeth after a fall from his bike. And there, in the center, was their wedding photo. Mark and Jessica, smiling, their faces alight with what I had believed was genuine love and promise. I remembered the wedding, standing beside Mark as he waited for her to walk down the aisle. "I'll take care of her, Dad," he'd whispered to me, his voice thick with emotion. "And I'll always take care of you." A promise made, a promise now broken. The sight of the photo now, of her hand on his arm, felt like a scene from a different life, a fiction I had willingly bought into. The betrayal wasn't just about money. It was about the desecration of vows, both public and private. The pain in my chest solidified, transforming from a raw ache into a block of ice. I stopped pacing. I had to know for sure. I stood motionless in the middle of the room. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but my hands were perfectly still. I knew what I had to do next. I would not call my son. I would not scream or hurl accusations into the phone. I would be calm. I would gather facts. My fingers felt strangely distant as I looked up the number for the Oak Room, my movements precise and deliberate. A polite, professional voice answered on the second ring. "Good evening," I said, my own tone level, a perfect imitation of normalcy. "I'm calling to confirm a reservation under the name Miller." There was a pause, the soft clicking of a keyboard in a bustling, cheerful world far from my silent living room. "Yes, sir," the hostess replied, her voice neutral. "That reservation is currently seated." The confirmation was all I needed. They were there. The lie was complete. "Is there a message you'd like me to pass along?" she asked. The question was standard procedure, but it felt loaded. An offer to send a message into their cozy, deceitful world. "No," I said, my voice colder than I intended. "No message." I ended the call and placed the phone back on the end table, my movements slow and deliberate. The silence of the room rushed back in, deafening. On the television, the crime drama had ended, the credits rolling over a final, triumphant musical score. Justice had been served in that fictional world. In mine, it was just beginning. There was no rage in my movements, no trembling in my hands as I picked up my keys. The anger had burned past hot and settled into something colder, denser, and far more dangerous: resolve. I was going to see this for myself. The drive to the Oak Room was a blur of streetlights and traffic, a familiar 10-mile stretch of city that felt alien and distant. The glacial anger that had taken root in my living room had not thawed. If anything, it had hardened into a sharp, clear resolve. This was no longer about a spoiled dinner or a wounded heart. It was about the truth, the raw, unvarnished truth that I needed to witness with my own eyes. My hands were steady on the steering wheel, my breathing even. The man who had carefully carved a roast just a few hours ago was gone, replaced by someone colder, more methodical. I was not driving toward a confrontation. I was driving toward a confirmation, a final visual piece of evidence in a case I was building in my mind. I found a parking spot on the opposite side of the street, directly across from the restaurant's expansive plate glass windows. I killed the engine, and the sudden silence inside the car was absolute. My vehicle became a darkened observation blind, a private theater from which to watch the final act of my own betrayal unfold. The Oak Room glowed with a warm, inviting amber light, a stark contrast to the cool darkness of my car. I could see the silhouettes of diners moving inside, the graceful ballet of waiters, and hear the faint, muffled hum of sophisticated enjoyment. It was a world of comfort and celebration, a world from which I had been deliberately and surgically removed. And then, through the glass, I saw them. They were seated at a prime table near the center of the dining room. Mark, my son; Jessica, his wife. And with them, an older, impeccably dressed couple I recognized instantly from the wedding photographs as Linda and Robert, Jessica's parents. The party of four. The words from the receptionist echoed in my mind, now imbued with a sickening clarity. The table was a portrait of abundance. There were half-eaten steaks on heavy ceramic plates, numerous side dishes in small white bowls, and 2 bottles of red wine, one nearly empty, the other freshly opened. It was a feast, an opulent display that went far beyond a simple Sunday dinner. They were laughing, their faces animated in the soft light. It was a perfect picture of familial bliss. I watched them for what felt like an eternity, my focus narrowing, tuning out the rest of the restaurant. I studied their interactions, the subtle currents of power and persuasion flowing between them. Jessica was the undeniable center of gravity. She was leaning forward, her hands gesturing emphatically as she spoke. There was an intensity in her posture, a focused energy that was less like casual conversation and more like a sales pitch. She was captivating her parents, who hung on her every word, their expressions a mixture of pride and rapt attention. Robert would nod occasionally, a thoughtful look on his face, while Linda smiled, completely charmed. This was not a chat. It was a performance. And Jessica was the star. Mark's role in this production was painfully clear. He was the supporting actor. He sat mostly in silence, a fixed, agreeable smile on his face. He laughed when they laughed, nodded when Jessica glanced at him for affirmation, and occasionally added a brief, corroborating comment. He looked like a man playing a part he had been assigned, a puppet whose strings were being pulled by the confident woman beside him. The sight of him, so passive and complicit in this charade, was what truly broke through my icy composure. This was not the man I had raised, the boy I taught to ride a bike, to be honest. To stand up for what was right was gone. In his place was a hollowed-out version, a man willing to trade his own father for the approval of his wife and her family. The pain of that realization was sharp, but it was quickly subsumed by a chilling understanding. This entire evening was a carefully orchestrated event. The lie about the work emergency was not just to exclude me, it was to create the perfect, uninterrupted opportunity to perform for Linda and Robert. The lavish meal, the expensive wine, all charged to my card, were props in their stage play, designed to project an image of success and prosperity. The memory of the $5,000 I had given Mark resurfaced, no longer a vague suspicion, but a glaring piece of a larger, more disturbing pattern. This was about money. It had always been about money, and I was not just the victim. I was the unwitting financier of my own erasure. My first instinct was primal. I wanted to storm across that street, burst through the heavy oak doors, and shatter their perfect, false little world. I wanted to see the looks on their faces when their lies were dragged into the light. I wanted to shout, to accuse, to unleash the torrent of hurt and anger that was raging inside me. But as quickly as the impulse arose, I crushed it. An emotional outburst would be a mistake. It would be messy, undignified. It would allow them to reframe the narrative, to paint me as the hysterical, unreasonable father, to cast themselves as the victims of my irrational rage. No, I would not give them that satisfaction. They had chosen the weapon of deceit, and I would respond not with emotion, but with cold, hard consequence. I sat in the darkness of my car for another 10 minutes, watching them order dessert. My own plan began to form, not in a flash of inspiration, but as a slow, deliberate construction, piece by logical piece. I would not be the storm that wrecked their ship. I would be the hidden reef they had steered themselves toward, the one they would crash upon through their own arrogance and greed. When the course of action was clear in my mind, a strange sense of calm settled over me. I took one last look at the happy family in the window. Then I took a deep, steadying breath, adjusted the collar of my jacket, and opened the car door. The cool night air was a welcome shock. I stepped out onto the pavement, my footsteps sounding unnaturally loud on the quiet street as I walked toward the glowing entrance of the Oak Room. I wasn't a man seeking a fight. I was a man coming to collect a debt. I pushed open the door, and the warm air and sounds of the restaurant washed over me. The hostess at the front podium smiled brightly. "Good evening, sir. Table for one?" she asked. I met her gaze without glancing toward my son's table. "Yes, please," I said, my voice even and calm. "A quiet corner, if you have one. I'm in no hurry at all." The hostess led me to a small, secluded table for two, tucked away in an alcove that offered a perfect, unobstructed view of the main dining floor while remaining in relative shadow. It was an ideal vantage point, a sniper's nest in a 5-star restaurant. I settled into the plush leather chair, the material cool against my back. From here, I could see them clearly. They were still engrossed in their conversation, their laughter occasionally rising above the sophisticated murmur of the room. A waiter appeared at my side, a silent and efficient presence. "Can I get you something to start with, sir?" he asked, his voice low and respectful. "Just a black coffee, please," I replied, my own voice unnaturally steady. "And I'll need a few minutes before I decide on anything else." He nodded and disappeared as quietly as he had arrived. My gaze returned to their table. They had finished their desserts, and the plates were being cleared away. Jessica was holding court, a radiant smile on her face as she spoke to her mother. Robert, her father, was leaning back in his chair, a look of deep satisfaction on his face. He looked like a man who had just been presented with a flawless business proposal. Mark, my son, was beaming, his eyes fixed on his wife with an expression of pure adoration. He looked proud. The sight sent a fresh, sharp pang of pain through my chest, but I pushed it down, compressing it into the cold, hard diamond of my resolve. They were celebrating a victory they believed was complete, secured by a simple lie and my unwitting generosity. They had no idea the game was still in play, and that their opponent was now in the room with them. The waiter returned with my coffee. The rich, dark aroma filled the air around me, a small, grounding comfort in the midst of the storm inside. I took a slow sip, the hot liquid a welcome shock to my system. I let the warmth spread through me, a final moment of calm before I set my plan into motion. I placed the cup back on its saucer with a soft click, then reached into my pocket and retrieved my phone. My movements were slow, deliberate, devoid of any hint of anger or haste. I was simply a man enjoying a cup of coffee, another anonymous diner in a room full of them. I navigated to my bank's contact information, my thumb hovering over the number for the 24/7 fraud and security hotline. This was the point of no return. With a final, deep breath, I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear. The automated system picked up instantly, a calm, synthesized voice guiding me through a menu of options. I pressed the number for reporting a lost or stolen card. After a brief hold, a live person answered, her voice professional and alert. "Fraud and security, this is the operator. How can I help you?" I kept my own voice low, barely above a whisper, leaning forward slightly as if sharing a confidence. "Hello," I began. "My name is Arthur Miller. I need to report my credit card as stolen. It's being used as we speak." I gave her the account number and confirmed my identity by answering a series of security questions, my mother's maiden name, the city where I was born. Each answer was a small, sharp piece of my history, now being used as a key to lock a door I had always left open for my son. "Okay, Mr. Miller, I see the account," the operator said, her tone all business. "I can confirm there have been several recent charges at a merchant called the Oak Room. Can you confirm you did not authorize these charges?" I watched Jessica laugh at something her father said, her head thrown back in carefree delight. "That's correct," I said into the phone, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I am at home. I did not authorize any of them." It was a lie, of course, but it was a necessary one, a strategic falsehood to counter their own. In this game, the truth was a flexible commodity. "Understood, sir. I am locking the card and all associated cards on this account immediately. No further charges will be approved." I could hear the rapid clicking of her keyboard, the sound of digital tumblers falling into place. "The lock is active," she confirmed a moment later. "We will open an investigation and send you the necessary paperwork." I thanked her for her efficiency and ended the call. It was done. The first move had been made. I placed my phone face down on the table and picked up my coffee cup, my hands perfectly steady. Now, all I had to do was wait. The minutes stretched out, each one feeling like an hour. I watched as their table was cleared of the last of the dessert plates. I saw the waiter approach them with a leather bill folder. He placed it discreetly in the center of the table. For a moment, no one moved. Then Jessica, with the casual air of a woman accustomed to taking charge, reached out and took the folder. She opened it, glanced at the total without a flicker of surprise, and then pulled a familiar-looking credit card from her wallet. My credit card. She handed it to the waiter with a confident smile. He took it and walked away towards the payment terminal at the back of the restaurant. This was it, the moment of reckoning. I held my breath, my eyes fixed on the waiter. He was gone for less than a minute, but it felt like a lifetime. He returned to the table, a slight frown on his face. He leaned down and spoke quietly to Jessica, who was in the middle of a story. She stopped, her smile faltering as she took the card back from him. I saw her lips form the words, "Try it again." The waiter nodded and walked away once more. The conversation at the table had stalled. Mark was looking at his wife, a question in his eyes. Robert and Linda were looking around, a faint air of confusion settling over their cheerful mood. The waiter returned a second time, his expression now one of polite apology. He shook his head. The card had been declined again. Jessica's confidence was visibly cracking. Her cheeks were flushed, a blotchy red spreading up her neck. She snatched the card from the waiter and examined it as if it had personally offended her. Then she opened her wallet again and pulled out a second card. I recognized it as the supplementary card I had given Mark for emergencies. She thrust it at the waiter with an impatient gesture. "Use this one," she commanded, her voice sharp enough to cut through the restaurant's ambient noise. The charade was beginning to unravel. The smooth, successful power couple was suddenly facing a very public, very common humiliation. A failed payment. The waiter, even the professional, took the second card and retreated. The silence at their table was now thick and heavy. When he returned for the third time, his face was a mask of regret. He shook his head again. "I'm very sorry, ma'am," I could just barely hear him say. "This one has also been declined." Jessica stared at him in disbelief, her mouth slightly agape. The illusion had shattered. The perfect evening, the flawless performance, had crashed into the mundane, unyielding reality of a locked account. Her face, which had been so animated and full of triumphant laughter just minutes before, was now a storm of confusion and fury. She looked around the restaurant, her eyes darting from the waiter to her parents, as if searching for someone to blame for this inexplicable failure. And then her frantic gaze swept across the room and landed on me, sitting quietly in my shadowed corner. Our eyes met. The color drained from her face, and the triumphant smile on her lips froze, cracking like thin ice. The moment our eyes met, the entire bustling restaurant seemed to fall silent, the ambient chatter and clinking of silverware fading into a dull, distant roar. For a heartbeat, there was only the silent, charged connection across the room. My calm, steady gaze, and Jessica's face, a mask of frozen disbelief. The triumphant smile she had worn all evening didn't just disappear. It shattered, leaving behind a jagged ruin of shock and dawning horror. Her knuckles were white, where she gripped the useless piece of plastic in her hand. The color had fled from her cheeks, leaving her skin looking pale and waxy in the restaurant's warm, forgiving light. It was as if she had seen a ghost, a specter from a world she thought she had successfully locked away for the evening. Her frantic, panicked energy was suddenly gone, replaced by a chilling stillness. Slowly, deliberately, I pushed my chair back, the legs making a soft scraping sound on the polished wooden floor. I placed my napkin neatly on the table beside my half-finished cup of coffee, a small, final gesture of order before I waded into the chaos I had created. I stood up, and with a pace that was neither hurried nor hesitant, I began to walk toward their table. Every step felt measured, each footfall landing with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the sudden, tense quiet that had enveloped that corner of the room. I could feel the eyes of other diners turning towards me, drawn by the palpable shift in atmosphere. A couple at a nearby table paused their intimate conversation, forks hovering in mid-air. A man further away lowered the financial section of his newspaper, peering over the top with undisguised curiosity. They could sense the impending drama, the way animals can sense an approaching storm. I ignored them, my focus entirely on the four people at the table, a family portrait now cracking at the seams. Mark was the next to see me. His head snapped up, following his wife's terrified gaze, and his face crumpled. The proud, adoring smile he had worn just moments before vanished, replaced by a look of such profound, childlike panic that for a fleeting second I almost felt a flicker of pity. He looked like a boy caught with his hand in the cookie jar, his mouth agape, his eyes wide with the certainty of imminent punishment. He seemed to shrink in his chair, his shoulders slumping as if under a physical weight. Robert and Linda, however, were still oblivious, their expressions merely confused. They looked from their daughter's pale face to their son-in-law's panicked one, trying to understand the sudden dramatic change that had swept over their table. Then, they followed Mark's gaze and saw me approaching. Their confusion only deepened. I stopped when I reached the edge of their table, standing over them like a quiet, patient judge. I let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of my presence to fully settle upon them. I looked at each of them in turn, my gaze lingering for a moment on Mark before finally coming to rest on Jessica. It was she who finally broke the silence, her voice a harsh, strained whisper that was a pathetic imitation of her earlier confidence. "Dad? What are you doing here? We thought you were at home." The question was an accusation, a desperate attempt to seize control of the narrative, to paint my presence as the intrusion, the violation. It was a weak, transparent gambit, and I refused to engage with it. Instead, I offered a small, thin smile that didn't reach my eyes. "It seems you're having some trouble with the bill," I said, my voice calm and conversational, yet loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear clearly. I gestured with my chin toward the declined credit cards on the table. Jessica flinched, as if I had struck her. "There's just a mix-up with the bank," she stammered, her eyes darting towards her parents, trying to project an air of normalcy that was utterly unconvincing. "It's nothing." Robert was starting to look deeply uncomfortable, a man of decorum who loathed public scenes. "Arthur," he began, his voice a low rumble, "perhaps this isn't the time or the place." "Oh, I think this is the perfect time and place," I replied, my voice hardening slightly. I looked directly at my son. "Mark called me this afternoon. He told me dinner was canceled. A work emergency for Jessica," he said. I let the words hang in the air, each one a small, sharp stone cast into the placid pool of their deception. Linda's hand went to her throat, her eyes wide with dawning comprehension. She was beginning to understand. "But it seems the dinner was only canceled for me. And it also seems that you decided to use my credit card to pay for the celebration I wasn't invited to." The silence that followed was absolute. The accusation was now laid bare, stripped of all ambiguity. It was ugly, and it was public. My son could not meet my eyes. He stared down at his plate, his face a miserable shade of red. Just then, a man in a sharp, dark suit approached the table with a practiced, non-threatening posture. He was the restaurant manager, his face a mask of professional concern. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice smooth and controlled, intended to de-escalate. Jessica seized the opportunity, turning to him with a look of manufactured relief. No problem at all," she said quickly, forcing a brittle smile. "Just a small family misunderstanding. And a little issue with our card. We can take care of it." She was trying to dismiss me, to handle the situation as a minor inconvenience. But I was not going to be dismissed. I turned to the manager, my expression serious. "Actually, there is a problem," I said, my tone firm and clear. "A crime has been committed. This woman," I gestured to Jessica, "has used my stolen credit card to pay for this meal." The manager's professional smile tightened. The word crime had changed the entire dynamic. This was no longer a family squabble over a dinner bill. "Stolen," he repeated, his eyes flicking from me to Jessica. Jessica gasped, a sound of theatrical outrage. "Stolen? That's ridiculous! He's my father-in-law! He gave us the card!" she insisted, her voice rising in pitch. "Did I?" I asked softly, turning my gaze back to her. "Did I give you permission to lie to me, to exclude me, and then to spend hundreds of dollars on a lavish dinner with your parents while I sat at home eating a frozen meal?" I then turned my attention fully to Robert, who was now looking at me with a mixture of horror and dawning suspicion. His mind was clearly working, piecing together the scene with the cold logic of a businessman. "Robert," I said, my voice dropping to a more personal, serious tone. "This isn't just about a dinner. I need you to listen to me very carefully. I held his gaze, forcing him to see the sincerity in my eyes. "I hope, for your sake, that you haven't agreed to whatever business proposal she presented to you tonight." Robert's face went rigid. My words had struck a nerve, a direct hit on the true purpose of the evening. "Because 6 months ago," I continued, my voice resonating with the weight of the final, devastating truth, "I gave them $50,000 of my retirement savings for a can't-miss investment opportunity she had put together. A brilliant startup," she said. "I'm still waiting to see a business plan. I'm still waiting to see a single dollar of it returned." The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. It was as if a bomb had gone off at the center of the table, and the fallout was pure, unadulterated horror. Linda let out a small, strangled cry, her hand flying to her mouth. Robert stared at his daughter, his face ashen, the look of a man who has just seen the trusted foundation of his world crumble into dust. He understood now. He understood the performance, the expensive meal, the carefully crafted narrative of success. It was all a prelude, a setup for the kill, and he and his wife were the intended prey. Jessica's face, for the first time, showed not anger or defiance, but pure, unadulterated fear. The mask was gone. The con was exposed. There was nowhere left for her to hide. The manager, witnessing this final, shocking revelation, took a half-step back, his expression grim. He had heard enough. He addressed Robert directly, man to man. "Sir, I'm very sorry for this disruption. However, there is the matter of a significant unpaid bill and a serious accusation. The parties involved cannot leave until this is resolved." The manager's final statement, delivered with the cold finality of a closing door, left no room for argument. The phrase "cannot leave" transformed the luxurious restaurant into a gilded cage. The immediate public spectacle of a police intervention was averted, but this was somehow worse. There was no authority figure to appeal to, no official process to hide behind. There was only the raw, inescapable humiliation of the situation, simmering under the watchful eyes of the entire dining room. The manager gave a subtle nod to a member of his staff near the entrance, a silent instruction to ensure his directive was followed. Then he retreated a respectful distance, a silent sentinel overseeing the quiet implosion of a family. The silence that descended upon our table was profound, a vacuum where laughter and conversation had once been. It was broken only by Linda's muffled sobs. Beside me, I saw Mark's hands begin to tremble, a fine tremor that rattled his water glass. He stared resolutely at a fixed point on the tablecloth, avoiding everyone's gaze as if my own stare might physically burn him. Robert, his face a stony mask of fury and shame, finally turned to his daughter. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet, venomous intensity of his words was more chilling than any shout. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The $50,000. Is it true?" Jessica couldn't meet his eyes. Her silence was a confession. Robert made a low, guttural noise of disgust and turned away, the grief of losing a daughter etched onto his face. I looked at my son. Mark was a ghost, pale and translucent, his eyes hollowed out with a despair so deep it seemed to have extinguished any light within him. He was trapped between the father he had betrayed and the wife who had led him to this ruin. He finally lifted his head and looked at me, and in his eyes I saw the shattered remnants of the boy I had raised. There was shame, regret, and a desperate, pleading sorrow. He opened his mouth, his lips forming my name, Dad, but the word came out as a choked, broken sound. I offered him nothing in return. No anger, no forgiveness, no comfort. I simply looked at him, my expression a mirror reflecting the consequences of his own choices. There was nothing left to say. The bond between us had been irrevocably severed, and we both knew it. The other diners, who had been the silent audience to our drama, began to stir, their hushed whispers a rising tide. They had witnessed the entire arc, the confident celebration, the humiliating decline of the cards, the shocking confrontation, and the final devastating revelation. We were a cautionary tale, a real-life soap opera played out between the appetizer and the digestive. I felt their pity, their morbid curiosity, their quiet judgment. It was a suffocating weight. I had achieved my goal. The truth was out, the deception exposed. But the victory felt hollow, the taste of it like ash in my mouth. There was no joy in this, only a profound, soul-wearying sadness. I had won, but I had lost my son. I knew I could not stay there a moment longer. My part in this tragedy was over. I looked at the manager, who was still standing watch nearby. I gave him a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement that I was leaving the resolution of the bill in his capable hands. I knew Robert, a man of pride and means, would not allow the indignity of an unpaid debt to linger. He would pay, and in doing so, he would be paying for his own naivete, for the blind spot he had for his own child. I turned without a word and walked away from the table, away from the wreckage of two families. I didn't look back. I walked through the silent, staring restaurant, my footsteps the only sound in my own ears. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the cool, clean night air. The street was quiet, the city lights blurring into a watercolor of indifference. I had walked into that restaurant to reclaim my dignity. I walked out of it utterly, completely alone. And so I told him. I laid it all out, from the canceled Sunday roast that started it all to the $50,000 investment that revealed the true depth of the deception. My voice was steady, factual. I presented the events dispassionately, a simple chronology of their deceit. I showed Sergeant Evans the transaction history on my phone, where the timestamps and amounts provided an undeniable digital trail leading directly to their table. I explained the pattern, demonstrating how this evening was not an isolated incident, but the culmination of months of financial exploitation. I kept my emotions buried deep, recounting everything not as a heartbroken father, but as a victim reporting a crime. My testimony was clinical, precise, and irrefutable, leaving no room for doubt or misunderstanding. I was building a case, brick by painful brick. Sergeant Evans listened without interruption, his pen scratching quietly across the page. When I finished, he asked a few pointed questions about the supplementary card and the $50,000 transfer. I answered, steady but hollow. He thanked me, then turned toward the others. I stayed where I was, a solitary shadow in the corner, watching as the circle closed in. Jessica sat straighter as Evans approached. Her composure had returned, and she slipped into the role of the aggrieved yet reasonable wife. Though I couldn't hear her words, her gestures betrayed her performance. The lean forward, the placating hands, the incredulous shake of her head. She was recasting betrayal as misunderstanding, painting me the overzealous fool. But beside her sat Mark. He shrank into silence, eyes pinned to the table. When asked, he could only nod or shake his head. He couldn't lie, not with me there, a living reminder of the truth. His silence was louder than any admission. Across the room, Robert gave his statement with the precision of a man who had built his life on clarity. Calm, clipped words, posture rigid, yet fury simmered beneath. Piece by piece, his account aligned with mine. The careful lattice Jessica had woven was unraveling under the weight of what could not be denied. The restaurant tried to reclaim its rhythm, waiters moving with forced calm, diners whispering behind glasses. Still, the air pulsed with tension. After what felt like hours, Evans returned. His face was grave. Based on statements and evidence, he explained, charges of credit card fraud and perhaps grand larceny were justified. But because this was family, he had to ask me one final time. Was I certain I wished to press charges? Once begun, the process would no longer belong to me. It was the last threshold. I could retreat, call it all a mistake, pay the bill, and step back into the night. For a moment, the temptation lingered, but then I saw my son. Tears carved down his cheeks, his face a portrait of devastation. The boy I had raised, the man I had loved, had betrayed me in a way I could scarcely comprehend. My chest tightened with grief, yet beside him was the wife who had orchestrated every deception. The consequences were handled by others in rooms I never entered. There were legal filings, a restitution order, and a court-mandated silence between us. The $50,000, along with the cost of that final disastrous meal, began to reappear in my bank account in small, impersonal monthly installments, garnished from their wages. It was a cold, clinical resolution to a deeply personal wound. I never saw or spoke to any of them again. The restraining order was a line drawn in the sand, a legal boundary that mirrored the emotional one I had been forced to erect. The silence was absolute. The legal outcome was, in the end, quite simple. Faced with the undeniable evidence of the credit card statements and the corroborating testimony from his own in-laws, Mark and Jessica accepted a plea deal. They were convicted of fraud. There was no jail time. Instead, they received 5 years of probation and were ordered to pay full restitution. This included the several $100s for the dinner at the Oak Room and the entire $50,000 from the fraudulent investment. A portion of their wages would be garnished every month until the debt was paid in full. It was a clean, mathematical consequence for a messy, emotional crime. I also filed for, and was granted, a restraining order. It was a legal formality, a line drawn in the sand that they never attempted to cross. I heard nothing from them, or from Robert and Linda, ever again. The silence was absolute. The months that followed were a period of quiet recalibration. The silence in my house, once a symbol of my loneliness, slowly transformed. It was no longer an emptiness, but a space that was mine alone, free from the tension of Jessica's polite condescension and the strain of Mark's divided loyalties. It became a peaceful silence, a quiet sanctuary. I started to reclaim my life in small ways, finding a new rhythm that was not defined by the expectations of anyone else. I was no longer just a father, I was Arthur again. And while there was a scar on my heart that would never fully fade, I found that it was possible to live with it, to build a new life around it that was authentic and, in its own quiet way, content. One evening, about a year after that night at the Oak Room, I was in my kitchen, preparing a simple meal for myself. The late sun was streaming through the window, just as it had on that fateful Sunday. But today, it felt different. It felt warm and cleansing. As I was chopping vegetables, my phone, sitting on the counter, let out a familiar ping. For a fraction of a second, my entire body tensed. A ghost of the old anxiety, a Pavlovian response to the sound that had started it all, shot through me, but I took a breath and glanced at the screen. It was a notification from a news app. It was meaningless noise from the outside world. I smiled, a small, genuine smile. The sound no longer had any power over me. It was just a sound. I finished making my dinner and sat down at my dining table, a table set for one. The meal was simple, grilled fish and fresh vegetables, but it tasted better than anything I had eaten in years. The house was quiet, filled only with the soft sounds of my own existence. I ate slowly, savoring the peace. I had lost a son, but I had found myself. I had learned the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes the most profound act of love is to let go, to draw a line, and to choose the quiet dignity of your own peace over the chaotic pain of a toxic bond. Trust is a fragile thing, and sometimes protecting yourself means making the hardest choice. What would you have done in this situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and thank you for following this journey.